Amidst the thick mud of the Russian plains and the smoke of war clouding Europe, there was a man who walked through the century with the steps of a soldier and an indomitable will. He was not born to become a legend, but history chose him. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, a soldier from the poor fields of Kaluga, who would later become a general that even Hitler trembled at the sound of his name. But before becoming the nightmare of Nazi Germany, Zhukov was just a farm boy, growing up amid harsh winters and poverty, where resilience was forged not by gunfire, but by the harshness of life itself. Let us return to the Russian countryside at the beginning of the 20th century, where the first form of a warrior god silently grew up amid the frost and hunger. The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes, or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article. Childhood to adolescence. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born on December 1, 1896, in the village of Strelkovka in the Kaluga region, a cold and impoverished land. His father, Konstantin, was a poor farmer, and his mother, Ustinya, was a tough, laboring woman who carried the weight of the family during times of hunger. They lived in a simple wooden house where winters lacked sufficient heating, and summers provided fields with barely enough grain to sell. From an early age, Zhukov was accustomed to hard work, waking up at dawn, wading through mud to lead the cows, helping his parents with plowing, and apprenticing in Moscow at just 12 years old. Schooling came to him in a fragmented manner. Every old book was treasured like a precious gem. However, what his apprenticeship teacher couldn't help but notice was the boy's strange memory, eyes sharp as a blade, and a constant silence, not from shyness, but from always observing. Zhukov's adolescence passed between two worlds. One was the hardship of the people. The other was the underlying turmoil in a Russia on the brink of change. He knew nothing of comfort, but understood the injustice early on. And it was from this life of hardship that Zhukov's determination and extraordinary endurance were forged. Silently, persistently, like the frozen layers of northern Russian soil. In 1915, Russia was struggling amid the smoke and fire of World War I. The fields of his homeland could no longer keep young men, as recruitment notices flooded every village. Zhukov, at just 19 years old, had no dreams of glory. He only knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to stand up. He joined the Tsarist army like many other peasants, wearing rough military uniforms, holding a rifle he wasn't used to, and thrown into the Western Front without any proper guidance. But in the mud and the lurking death, Zhukov revealed his innate qualities of a commander. He didn't stand out due to his status or education, but because of his cold resilience, his calmness amidst chaos, and his ability to find a retreat when the whole unit was panicking. Not long after, he was promoted to sergeant, then to a higher rank, a rare achievement for someone without noble lineage. But the war was merciless to Zhukov. He was wounded by a shell fragment and had to return to the rear. His wound healed gradually, but the country did not. Russia was fracturing from within. In 1917, the February Revolution broke out. Tsarist soldiers revolted, and mutinies spread everywhere. By the end of the year, the Bolshevik government took power. Amid the bloodshed and chaos, Zhukov, like many poor soldiers, chose to stand with those promising to overthrow the feudal oppression. In 1918, he joined the Red Army, leaving behind his past under the Tsar. A new chapter began, one in which Zhukov would no longer be an ordinary soldier. The revolution and civil war would forge him, not only with guns and bullets, but with iron discipline and the ruthless decisions that history would have to acknowledge. Forged in steel, Zhukov, in the furnace of the Russian Civil War. When the October Revolution succeeded and the Bolshevik government took power, Russia was plunged into a bloody civil war between Lenin's Red Army and the counter-revolutionary White forces. Amid this chaos, Zhukov, now an officer in the Red Army, entered a new chapter where loyalty was not only to the leadership, but also to an ideal of social justice. Zhukov had no time to think about communist theory. The war demanded something else: discipline, courage, and the necessary ruthlessness. Assigned to the cavalry, a crucial branch in the vast mobile warfare of Russia, he quickly proved himself. From the southern steppes to the vast lands of central Russia, Zhukov participated in campaigns against the White forces, foreign interventionists, and secessionist groups. The lands he passed through left stories of blood and dust, but also clearly painted the portrait of an officer maturing in the way war truly teaches people to grow. For Zhukov, the Civil War was not only a place to affirm loyalty to the new Soviet government, but also the harshest school. He learned to command in situations of scarcity, lacking guns, food, and even the trust of his subordinates. But he knew how to keep people, maintain his army, and preserve lives, not through speeches or promises, but through decisiveness, clear orders, and his own presence in the most dangerous places. The Civil War ended in the early 1920s. The Red Army emerged victorious. The country lay in ruins, and Zhukov, now a fully fledged officer of an army that was gradually becoming the backbone of a new nation, was sent to study at military academies of the Red Army, a clear sign that he was being noticed. His battlefield talents were not wasted. The edge of the desert, Khalkhin Gol, and the first encounter with the Empire. At the end of the 1930s, while Europe was slowly slipping into the shadows of war, another storm quietly brewed in the east. The border between Mongolia and Manchukuo, the land occupied by Japan, became a flashpoint, where imperialism and the proletarian revolution were about to collide. In 1939, as conflict erupted between Japanese forces and the Mongols backed by the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov was appointed commander of the Soviet Mongolian forces, with the rank of Major General. This was the first time he was given command of a vast strategic battlefield, and also the first time he faced a modern, battle-hardened army like the Japanese Empire. Zhukov brought not only his command skills to the battlefield, but also a spirit of reform, something he had absorbed after many years of serving and studying at Soviet military academies. He quickly assessed the situation. The Japanese fought fiercely, relying on highly mobile infantry and bold attacks. But Zhukov understood that if he fought the enemy's way, he would lose. Thus, he chose his own way, counterattacking with tanks, mobile artillery, and a completely organized logistics system. In August 1939, Zhukov ordered a full-scale attack, and it was also the first steel punch that the Red Army delivered in modern warfare. In that campaign, he encircled 70,000 Japanese soldiers, utterly destroying them with a combined arms approach: infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support working together. The victory at Khalkhin Gol was not just a military triumph, it was a declaration. For the first time, the Soviet Red Army, under Zhukov's direct command, defeated a large army of a fascist power. The Japanese Empire, which had been considering expanding northward into Manchuria, was forced to retreat and shift its focus southward toward the Pacific. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the name Zhukov began to rise as a rising star, not just in military circles, but in the eyes of Stalin. This victory was not only written in military textbooks, but also restored the honor of a Red Army that had just undergone brutal purges during which many generals were executed on suspicion of betrayal. Amid the uncertainty and fear, Zhukov stood out as a survivor, not just surviving, but prevailing. The bells of Barbarossa, when war reached the gates of Moscow. On the morning of June 22, 1941, before the sun could rise, the roar of artillery, the screeching of planes, and the long lines of tanks stretching for miles signaled the beginning of a nightmare. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union, was the largest attack in modern history. Over 3 million German soldiers, along with tens of thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, attacked Soviet territory from 3 directions: north, central, and south, with terrifying speed and destruction. At that time, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was the chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. For several months before, he had noticed signs of unusual activity along the border. Large troop movements, new supply stations, and intelligence reports from various sources suggesting an impending invasion. Zhukov had issued multiple reports, trying to convince Stalin of the obvious threat, even proposing a general mobilization or a preemptive strike. But Stalin, obsessed with the loyalty of Hitler through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, dismissed these warnings. He believed this was just a trick from the British to provoke the Soviets into war. Then, when the real blow came, it brought widespread collapse. The Soviet army was completely unprepared. Hundreds of planes were destroyed on the tarmac, and forward units disintegrated in just a few hours. Within 2 weeks, the Germans had advanced hundreds of kilometers, capturing Minsk, then Smolensk, and nothing seemed to stop them from heading straight for Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner in vast encirclements. In the midst of this crisis, Georgy Zhukov remained at the command post. He directed a strategic retreat while trying to build temporary defensive lines to buy time. But the losses were too great, too sudden, and the morale of the army, devastated by the previous purges, caused resistance to falter. Stalin, who had previously coldly dismissed all concerns, now fell silent, locking himself in the Kremlin for days without issuing orders. By September, as the situation continued to deteriorate, Stalin decided to send Zhukov to Leningrad, which was also under siege by the Germans, to save the city. In just a few weeks, Zhukov established a solid defense system that prevented the Germans from breaking through. But a larger threat still loomed to the south: Moscow. In October 1941, realizing that the Germans were preparing for a full-scale assault on the capital, Stalin once again called Zhukov, this time not to argue, but to entrust him with the task. Amid the chaos and despair spreading across the city, Zhukov was given command of the entire Western Front, to defend Moscow at any cost. Moscow Front. Winter, blood, and steely will. When Zhukov arrived in Moscow, it was late autumn. The cold silently began to spread across the fields, roads, and trenches. But what was colder than the temperature was the atmosphere within the city. Vehicles, supplies, and central offices had started retreating east. The people were afraid, packing their belongings, waiting for the unspoken truth. The capital might be abandoned. The Germans, under the command of Hitler and generals like Guderian and Bock, launched Operation Typhoon, the decisive strike into the heart of the Soviet Union. They believed that capturing Moscow would cause the collapse of the Soviet political system. The tank divisions advanced like a storm, creating massive pincer movements. Zhukov knew that he couldn't win by numbers or equipment. The Red Army had suffered millions of casualties since June. Therefore, he relied on the depth of the defensive lines and the endurance of the Soviet soldier. He set up a multi-layered system of trenches, mines, fortifications, and used the terrain to slow down the enemy. Newly formed divisions, though not fully trained, were sent into battle. At the same time, he ordered units to be urgently transferred from Siberia, where they were guarding against Japan, based on intelligence confirming that Japan would not attack. Then the cold came earlier than expected. The Germans, unprepared for the harsh winter, began to slow down. Their oil froze, soldiers lacked warm clothes, and supply lines were disrupted. Meanwhile, the Red Army, born from the snowy lands, began their counteroffensive. On December 5, 1941, under Zhukov's direct command, a series of Siberian divisions were thrown into battle from both flanks. The Moscow winter counteroffensive erupted like the fury that had been building up for half a year. The Germans were taken by surprise and had to retreat, marking the first time since the war began that they took a step back. Zhukov not only held the capital, he did something greater. He reignited the faith in the Soviet people that the enemy could be pushed back, that the motherland was not entirely hopeless. Moscow stood firm, and with it, the spirit of Russia remained unbroken. Stalingrad, the maelstrom of life and death. When the summer of 1942 arrived, the Eastern Front once again heated up like a furnace. After his failure to capture Moscow, Hitler changed his objective. This time, he aimed to seize the oil-rich Caucasus region and cut off the Soviet supply lines. The spearhead of the operation, named Operation Blau, was directed toward the city named after Stalin, Stalingrad. For Hitler, capturing the city was not only a strategic victory, but also a symbolic humiliation for Stalin. For Stalin, defending it was a matter of personal honor, an absolute command. And for Georgy Zhukov, who was called in when the situation became dire, Stalingrad would be the biggest gamble since Moscow. The German forces launched a powerful attack. Within a few weeks, they had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city on the banks of the Volga River turned into a maze of rubble, debris, and smoke, where firefights took place in every house, on every floor, behind every wall. Soviet soldiers had no way to retreat. Behind them was the river, and beyond the river, the motherland. However, when it seemed the world thought Stalingrad was about to fall, Zhukov was silently preparing a decisive blow. Together with generals like Alexander Vasilevsky and Konstantin Rokossovsky, he devised Plan Uranus, a counteroffensive from both flanks to encircle the entire German Sixth Army under the command of Friedrich Paulus, which was trapped in the city. On November 19, 1942, as winter began, Operation Uranus erupted. From the frozen steppes, Soviet armored forces, consisting of over 1,000 tanks, unexpectedly broke through the weak defenses of the Romanian and Hungarian forces guarding the German flanks. Within just 4 days, the encirclement was complete. Over 300,000 Axis troops were completely cut off from their rear. Zhukov did not immediately order a general assault. He allowed time and the cold to weaken the enemy. The German forces inside Stalingrad fell into despair. Starvation, lack of ammunition, and fuel shortages caused their morale to crumble day by day. Hitler ordered that no surrender be permitted, but in reality, they were dying in silence. On February 2, 1943, General Paulus, who had been promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler with the hope that he would commit suicide rather than surrender, did the opposite. He surrendered the entire German force. This was the first time the Nazi German army suffered a total defeat, losing an entire army group. Zhukov did not just win, he changed the course of the war. After Stalingrad, the Red Army, once pushed to the brink, began to take the offensive. And from that moment on, Zhukov's name began to be mentioned as the savior of Soviet Russia. Kursk, the steel arena between two empires. In the summer of 1943, after the humiliating defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler swallowed his anger and sought an opportunity for revenge. The Nazi high command knew that time was not on their side. The Allies were soon to land in Italy, and the Eastern Front was gradually collapsing. A decisive victory, a deadly blow to break the initiative of the Red Army was imperative, and they chose Kursk, a bulge on the Soviet-German front. The operation was named Operation Citadel, a two-pronged attack involving over 900,000 German troops, more than 2,700 tanks, and nearly 10,000 artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht brought terrifying new weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks, steel beasts expected to crush all resistance. But on the other side, Georgy Zhukov was no longer the general who had to react passively. Thanks to intelligence gathered by Soviet spies and information from the former agent Richard Sorgi, Zhukov correctly predicted the time and direction of the German attack. He did not wait. He turned Kursk into a massive fortress. 8 defensive lines, thousands of trenches, minefields, and artillery positions. Over 1 million troops, 3,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, 20,000 artillery pieces, and a steel will were all in place to await the Wehrmacht. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel was launched. German tanks roared forward, seemingly unstoppable. But then, they ran into dense fire, mines exploding, and anti-tank guns like ZIS-3, 45mm, and 76mm firing from every bush and hilltop. The focal point of the battle was Prokhorovka, where the largest tank battle in human history took place. Over 1,500 tanks from both sides collided on the muddy fields, where the distance between the steel monsters was only a few meters. The crews fought at all costs, whether their tracks were broken, their engines burned, or they had to collide like ancient gladiators. Zhukov, now Deputy Supreme Commander, did not directly command on the front lines, but the entire defense and counter-offensive plan bore his mark. Perfect coordination between branches of the military, the ability to predict movements, and timely force coordination. When the German forces were exhausted, Zhukov and Stavka launched the counterattack, Operation Kutuzov and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, sweeping the Wehrmacht out of the Kursk bulge, opening the way for the subsequent liberation of Ukraine and Belarus. The victory at Kursk not only halted Hitler's final counter-offensive on the Eastern Front, it proved that the Red Army had matured, learned how to fight total warfare, and that generals like Zhukov were not only capable of defending but could also counterattack with deadly precision. Operation Bagration, the Red Tsunami, sweeping away the Wehrmacht. In June 1944, while all eyes in the West were focused on Normandy, where the Allies were preparing to land, a plan even greater and more brutal was silently forming in the minds of the Soviet generals and on the maps of the Eastern Front. Zhukov, now the Deputy Supreme Commander, was tasked by Stalin with a crucial mission: to completely annihilate the German Army Group Center, the backbone of the Wehrmacht holding Belarus, a fortress that had remained unbreached since 1941. Opposing Zhukov was over 800,000 German troops, commanded by seasoned generals like Ernst Busch. However, what they did not know was that a red flood was brewing behind the mist of Belarusian forests. Operation Bagration launched on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Hitler initiated Operation Barbarossa. It was a symbol of revenge, meticulously calculated. The Red Army mobilized over 2.3 million soldiers, nearly 6,000 tanks, 30,000 artillery pieces, and over 5,300 aircraft, spread across a front nearly 1,000 kilometers wide. A sophisticated deception network was set up. Fake artillery, inflatable tanks, and false intelligence, which misdirected the Germans into incorrectly focusing their defense. Zhukov did not attack head-on. He breached the flank of the German Army Group Center, cutting off and surrounding pieces of it, using overwhelming armored forces to smash the Wehrmacht's communication and supply lines. The battles at Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev were seismic shocks that caused the entire German defense line to collapse. By the end of June, the Germans were in full retreat, chaotic, withdrawing amid flames and burning vehicles. The entire Army Group Center, more than 350,000 men, was either destroyed, captured, or disintegrated. It was a disaster greater than Stalingrad. Operation Bagration was not just a military victory, it shattered the illusion of the Nazi resistance's strength and opened the gates leading to Poland, East Germany, and ultimately Berlin. At this point, Zhukov became a living symbol of the Red Army, not just for his strategic genius, but for his ability to listen to the reality on the ground, adjust plans according to the situation, and weigh the lives of his soldiers in his strategic decisions. Zhukov, the forgotten hero. The war ended. Berlin had collapsed. But for Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, a new battle began. Not against Nazi Germany, but against the silent suspicions that lingered within the Kremlin. Zhukov emerged from the war as an indisputable hero. He was the greatest general of the Red Army, the man who had saved Moscow, defended Leningrad, crushed the German forces at Stalingrad, swept them from Belarus, and ultimately forced Hitler to commit suicide in the darkness of Berlin. Statues, medals, and victory songs all called his name. But Stalin did not. The king of victory, as the West called Zhukov, gradually became a thorn in the side of the dictator. Zhukov was too prominent, too loved by the people. He was a symbol of victory, something Stalin wanted to keep exclusive. And so, right after the victory parade in Red Square in 1945, led by Zhukov himself on a white horse, he was gradually pushed away from the center of power. Zhukov was assigned to command the Odessa Military District, then the Ural Military District. Far from the capital, far from the spotlight. His powers were stripped, and he was closely monitored, no longer allowed to attend the Politburo meetings. These were silent, painful years when the hero of the people was pushed into obscurity by his own homeland. But Zhukov's fate was not over. After Stalin's death in 1953, Zhukov was unexpectedly restored by Nikita Khrushchev, who needed him to purge Stalin's remnants and regain power. In 1955, Zhukov became the Soviet Minister of Defense. He carried out military reforms, raised discipline, and modernized weapons. He also played a key role in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, with a swift and bloody campaign. However, it was his independence and vast influence within the military that once again caused jealousy. Khrushchev, who had brought him back, was the one who dismissed him in 1957 for violating the collective principle. This time, Zhukov did not return. Later life. He lived his final years in silence and humility, staying away from politics, writing memoirs, and conversing with old soldiers. However, the hearts of the people never forgot him. When Georgy Zhukov passed away in 1974, he was laid to rest in the honored cemetery at the Kremlin Wall, a resting place reserved for the greatest sons of Russia. He was the most victorious general in World War II, a commander who led with both intellect and blood, with ruthlessness when necessary, and compassion when possible. He became a living symbol of the Soviet people's resistance and victory. If history were an orchestra, Zhukov was not just a player, he was the conductor of the entire symphony. A symphony that was fierce, bloody, yet guided an entire nation through the deepest suffering to rise again. Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.